I started making sense of it.
Welcome to Welcome to Conversations in Color, a weekly series committed to open, honest conversation and exploring hard questions regarding race and racism in Western Wisconsin and beyond. Here is your host, Ed Hudgens.
Well, hello there and welcome to Conversations in Color, emanating from the beautiful RCU Theater here at the Pablo Center at the Confluence. So glad you're joining in. We are really excited about the show tonight, but we'll get into those details in a little bit. But before we go any further, I wanted to mention that the mission of this show, this project, is to create a space for us to talk about race and racism issues in the Chippewa Valley and Western Wisconsin and beyond. And we do it in a certain way. We have kind of an ethos or pillars that we try to cling to as we're talking to one another. One is humanity, just the basic value of being a human being and the dignity that's there. So we're not going to devalue or vilify anybody. One is honesty. We're going to lean in on the hard questions and not be afraid to ask them and look at the ramifications of the answers. And then lastly is humility. We want to recognize that not all of us know, well, when it comes down to it, we don't know a whole lot. We know some things, and sometimes with what we know, we can be pretty dangerous. So we need to have a lot of humility as we're talking about these heavy subjects together. But before we get into the subject matter for the night, I want to introduce you to our wonderful panelists. First up, we have Shang Laura Waldinger, who is a partner here with Conversations in Color. She's a part of the team here. She has a great podcast called the Social Exchange Project, and I say great not only because she recently had CiC and me on there. She does social work here in the state of Wisconsin and works with families in need. Welcome, Shang. So glad that you're...
Thank you so much for having me. It's a little weird to be on this side of the camera, just to be honest with you, but thank you for having me.
Yeah, but you belong there. You belong there.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Dr. Salika Ducksworth-Lawton, who is our resident panelist of sorts here and my partner in crime. And she is one of the folks that has really helped to get Conversations in Color going here. She works at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire teaching history. She also is the president of Uniting Bridges, and she's up to all other kinds of good stuff as well. Welcome, Salika.
Thank you. Here I'm comic relief, but it's okay.
Next up, we have Dr. Ka Vang. She is the Associate Director of the McNair Program at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. The McNair Program, if you're not familiar, is a scholarship type of program that prepares undergrads for doctoral work, and it focuses on underserved communities, people that may not have the resources that other folks might have. And she has been with the university for about 10 years. Welcome, Ka. We appreciate you being here.
I feel like it's going to be so much fun tonight.
All right. All right. And then last but certainly not least, well, not really, because we have one more after Dang here, but we have Dang Yang, who is the Director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs at the University of Wisconsin in Eau Claire. Passionate and working in the area of social justice in the context of educational opportunities. Has been working in that arena for about 11 years or so, if my math was correct.
That's correct.
Welcome, Dang. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for being here. Yeah, for letting me be here.
Absolutely. Wouldn't have it any other way. All right. Now, the last but not least, we have a guy who is integral to this whole operation. His name is Adam Akala. He works with CoLab, and he is really an integral part of Conversations in Color. So, Adam, what are you doing here tonight?
Hey, Ed, happy to be a part of this project. Tonight, I will be watching the Paragon live stream and asking any of our community questions to our panel. So if you have a question, either drop it in the chat on the Paragon live stream or right-click my name and you can private message me. If you're joining us tonight on the radio at 99.9 FM Converge Radio, you can email those questions to conversations@tomeswab.com. That's conversations@TOMMESUAB.com. We might not have time to get all of the questions, but we'll do our best and save your questions for future episodes if we can sneak them in somewhere.
Sounds great. Now, I understand that you might have a question.
Yes. So the most important question that we like to ask our panelists is our icebreaker question. So kind of keeping it a little bit light, I've got a would you rather question for tonight. So would you rather go back in time and meet your ancestors or travel to the future and meet your descendants?
Do I have to give a why? I know I go first.
Yeah.
I know you're going to throw me right out there, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut to it here. Frankly, I don't really want to meet my ancestors. I don't want to get into why. Has something to do with my my ethnicity and what I'll probably find when I go back, to be honest with you. I think I'd be much more interested in meeting my descendants, and hopefully they'll be coming in and creating a better place than my ancestors did. So, Dang, how about you?
Oh, good question. I would particularly be interested in meeting my ancestors, so going back in time. I think that has a lot to do with my own perspective and my own the way that I was raised to take a look at my ancestors, my elders, and so I'm always really interested in understanding the context of where I am today and all the things that led up to that particular point. And so I would be really interested in going back in time.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting, Ding.
Yeah.
I think I would, I'm at the point where I think I would like to look towards the future. I think it'd be really cool to just see the future and how the future generation is able to keep our legacies alive, if it's alive at all.
Ominous thought.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard. I'm a historian, so there's a part of me that wants to go back and figure out how my Uncle Zuzu went from selling voodoo remedies to building a pharmacy and things like that. But I do want to see if my descendants manage to do something good in the world.
So what you're saying is that you're not going to answer the question?
I don't know. I don't like the question.
Well, Shane, can you rescue this, please?
I'll try. But I definitely, hands down, would go back in time and meet my ancestors, because I think it would allow me to have more insight on where I came from. And that's kind of maybe the journey I'm on right now, is to understand my roots so that I can appreciate my present so I can build a better future.
Awesome. That's great.
Did I rescue it?
You did. You totally cleaned up Salika's mess.
Thank you.
Nice job. Well, we're talking about the Hmong experience in the Chippewa Valley tonight, and I thought it would be important for us to lay a little bit of historical background before we get into our discussion. And I've got experts on the panel who will correct me if I go astray in my telling of the story. But I did a little bit of review of Hmong history here recently, and I have to tell you it was heartbreaking as I was going through it. So the Hmong people originated in remote areas in China, kind of away from the cities and away from the Chinese imperial entity. But in the 1800s, the Chinese imperials expanded and were expanding their territory throughout China, and eventually drove the Hmong people basically out of China and into the mountainous regions of Southeast Asia. And specifically, for our purposes tonight, they were driven into Laos. One thing I want to mention is that when they were in China, they were an ethnic minority. When they went to Laos, they were an ethnic minority. And certainly when they went into Laos, there was tension with the native Laotians as well. In 1893, the French moved in and decided to impose their will and create Indochina in Southeast Asia, and Laos was a part of that. In World War II, the Laos sided with the French against the Japanese. There were some who didn't, who sided actually with communists, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. But the division between the Hmong that had started in World War II continued and intensified as you got past World War II. And so you had the people who were loyal to the French, and then you had the people who were loyal to the communists. A group, I believe, called the Pathet Lao became known as the Pathet Lao. Now, and then you've got the United States coming into the scene as well. Now, back in the Cold War times, there was something that a lot of politicians and military leaders believed in. It was called the domino theory, that as communist countries expanded and got more countries to become communist, it was just going to be one after another, after another, after another, and especially in Asia, more specifically Southeast Asia. Now, in Laos, there was an agreement, a treaty, a ceasefire, in which basically the U.S. military was obligated to be neutral. They couldn't put boots on the ground in Laos. But what was happening in Laos is you still had this tension between the communists and what had been traditionally the French loyalists, and that conflict was continuing to brew and continuing to intensify. And then as you had tensions rising in Vietnam and other places in Southeast Asia, it only intensified that much more in Laos. And since the U.S. military couldn't be on the ground, we bombed. We bombed Laos over and over and over again. In fact, Laos is allegedly the most bombed land on Earth. To give you context, between 1964 and 1973, 2.3 million tons of bombs were dropped on Laos over the course of 580,000 bombing missions. Now, a lot of those missions were focused on strategic posts on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, aiming for North Vietnamese sanctuaries and mines and things like that. And so we were bombing, even though the United States couldn't have soldiers' feet on the ground, we were bombing them over and over and over and over again. In fact, I just recently watched a documentary that talks about how many explosives are still sitting in the ground that haven't been exploded yet. In 1960, the communist group, the Pathet Lao, took over the capital city in Laos. And in response to that, President Kennedy spoke up and said that, and authorized covert operations in which the U.S. government would recruit local people from ethnic minority groups to fight our battle for us on the ground. And his quote was, when he was making an announcement at a press conference in 1961, "I want to make it clear to the American people and to all of the world that all we want in Laos is peace, not war. A truly neutral government, not a Cold War pawn, a settlement concluded at the conference table and not on the battlefield." Again, that's John F. Kennedy from 1961. The irony of those words will become more evident as we continue on. In 1960-61, the CIA started recruiting those ethnic minority groups, specifically Hmong people, and then called them guerrilla units, strategic guerrilla units. And these folks were paid $3 a month to fight our battles for us. In 1968 and 1969, 18,000 Hmong soldiers were killed. And as time went on, we recruited more and more Hmong soldiers to fight these battles. There was a quote from an employee of the International Volunteer Service who talked about in 1968 they had gathered together 300 volunteers from Hmong men and boys. Of those 300, 30% were only 14 years old. 30% were 15 and 16, and 40% were 45 years old or older. And this employee said, "Where were the ones in between? I'll tell you, they're all dead." The average age of a Hmong soldier in 1971 fighting in what we call the secret war was 15 years old. Now, despite many U.S. assurances toward Hmong people in Laos that we would take care of them, win or lose, whatever happens, we will take care of you, we found out that quite the opposite happened. In February of 1973, a treaty was signed in Paris, and the U.S. forces started to withdraw from Laos. In 1975, the Pathet Lao took over ruling Laos. The communists had control of Laos in 1975, and what that practically did is it created 120,000 Hmong refugees in their own homeland. In this conflict, in the secret war, 50,000 Hmong people were killed or wounded. a quarter of all men and boys from the Hmong population were killed. And once the Pathet Lao came into power, they had an aggressive effort to go and find all of the Hmong who had sided with the CIA and with the U.S. government and did horrific things, killing, raping, destroying. And refugees, the Hmong refugees that stayed alive, tried to flee to Thailand where they would be safe going across the Mekong River. The first of these refugees to come to the United States were in November of 1975, where they came to Minnesota. And just on a very practical note, coming from Southeast Asia to Minnesota in November, I can imagine the culture shock almost immediately, what that would be like. But I can only imagine. And while we had the first wave of Hmong settlers come in 1975, or Hmong refugees, the last wave didn't come until 2005. So what that means practically is there were families of refugees living in camps in Thailand for 30 years before they were allowed to come over here. So, my esteemed panelists, what did I miss?
I'm going to jump in.
Please.
You know, really, Hmong resistance is there from the beginning, from 1450. And in World War I, a Hmong leader, Pachai, fought the French to a standstill and forced reforms. But that's really the beginning of two sets of Hmong groups. One who would be loyal to the French because they became the people who worked for the French and the Naibangs collecting taxes, etc., and one who would resist, one set of groups. So we talk about Hmong peoples in that sense because there's multiple. As you move into World War II, the people who were loyal to the French and some of the people who had been resisting worked with the French resistance, and the Hmong really were the backbone of the French resistance, and they helped with getting American pilots and French pilots out. They were part of the Doolittle raids. They will go through, and as we move out of World War II, they stay in the hills and they resist. And you have to understand, resistance is the center of Hmong history. Being in the hills, being very fierce fighters, being really incredible guerrilla fighters in many ways, with first the French, then the Japanese, and then native Lao, trying to kill them, trying to force them into work levies, trying to force them to grow opium. And you can see resistance through the clothing, you see resistance through the language, you see resistance through everything. 1954, you see the Geneva Accords that ended the Korean War. And those Geneva Accords also, that end it deals with the Korean War, it deals with the Vietnam Indo-Chinese uprising. And a part of those Geneva Accords was to guarantee that Laos and that Thailand would have independence. And that's why Americans were not allowed to have boots on the ground. But there had been an earlier secret agreement between the U.S. and the USSR that as long as it wasn't American soldiers and Soviet soldiers, they could proxy war in Vietnam.
Which is really gross.
Which is really gross. Move into 1960, there's a brewing civil war in Laos, and Bill Lair, who is a CIA gentleman and who becomes one of the champions of Hmong peoples, recruits then a captain named Vang Pao. And Vang Pao is, in American military history, we're only really beginning to understand the genius he had for using people and strategically working with people on the battlefield. He's going to be part of the first wave that winds up pushing back that Pathet Lao, the communist Lao. And because of that, he is going to get a number of battlefield commissions. but working for the CIA, he is the one who recruits Hmong, in part because the Ho Chi Minh Trail mainly runs through Laos. If you look at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, 75% of it is in Laos. So you needed people in the hills areas to be able to interdict the trail. You needed Hmong peoples to interdict the trail because Hmong peoples knew that trail. Hmong people knew how to blend into the forest. And when you got down to the one flat area, the Plain des Jars, the Plain of Jars, they were the ones who could help American pilots who had to bail out over the Plain of Jars. They could get them to Thailand, to the CIA base in Thailand. So they're saving American pilots. They're interdicting the trail. They're chasing the communists. And eventually, because of a shortage of pilots, Hmong men will become pilots, some of whom will be as young as 15. And because we did not have a written Hmong language at that point in time, they're learning to fly P-52s and all of these World War II aircraft orally, which is, if you go to Dayton to write Patterson, go get into one of those props. This is, I'm talking about a really, really difficult feat. And they will take over some of the bombing for us. 1968 is the high point for American soldier deaths. But for Hmong, it's 1973. Between 1970 and 1973, the U.S. begins to pull out in something called Vietnamization. So we're turning the war more and more over to Hmong, over to South Vietnamese. But that's where you're seeing these numbers.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you're getting to 73, it's 15, 14, and 12-year-old boys. And the Pathet Lao hate Hmong people. I have to make that really clear. The Treaty of Paris says that we were supposed to support Hmong peoples, but Richard Nixon, who was the president, wound up leaving office. And Gerald Ford decided not to. From 1973 to pretty much 1981, what you see is a Hmong genocide. You see people fleeing through the forest. You see people gunned down. I mean, really, the two books I would say people should be reading is Tragic Mountains and Harvesting Pashai's Reed. Because Tragic Mountains is an oral testimony, and people are telling you, especially at the bridge where they're trying to cross this one bridge over the Mekong Delta, and they're basically being used for shooting practice to try to get across the bridge.
So, just real quick, if I can interject, one of the things that struck me, and so I'm going to use this as a segue here to our question I want to ask, especially Sheng, Deng, and Ka, from your understanding. But like, what I have seen is the Hmong people, the resistance was probably out of necessity, because they were always a minority group in the spaces where they were at, and persecuted, the objects of genocide. So they come to the United States starting in 1975, and most people have no idea really who they are or what they were about. So what was it like from what you guys understand? What was it like for the first Hmong refugees when they came here and settled in the upper Midwest?
I could jump in.
Please.
And say, I would say definitely a challenge. As we mentioned before, you know, the weather in Laos is very, very different from Minnesota, Wisconsin. For many, coming to you know those regions, it's the first time they experience and see snow. Right? In addition, I think definitely the culture and the language barrier was there. Many people came, actually just about everyone came without zero knowledge of the English language. I recall my own journey to the U.S. and the various camps that my family had to go through. And at one of the camps, they were teaching my parents some very, very basic common English languages like yes and no. And so once we actually arrived in the U.S., all these people talking English to us. And I remember as an 8 or 9 year old, child, the only thing I heard at the end was the SSSS. It's like, and I was thinking, what in the world language is this? And would I ever be able to learn it, right? And because honestly, at that young of age, I would never thought that I would be where I am today. It's just really interesting. And I think about the sacrifices my parents went through to get us here, making the decision to go to a country where they could not speak a single language, had no idea what it's going to be like. You hear them growing up saying yes and no to questions that they are being asked, but they had no clue what they are agreeing to, what they're saying yes to. As a child, I think about, I had this experience, but, I just had fun growing up. But when I think back as an adult and reflect on the challenges and the choices that my parents had to make, I can't imagine that as an adult, if I had to make those choices, I don't know if I would have made the same choices. But they continued and got us here and gave us an opportunity that we never even thought we would have. And I think about the difficulties they experienced. For instance, I recall an experience where, for some reason, in the area that we were living at, it's not like we had more than anyone else in our neighborhood, but we had a lot of cars because we had a large family. There's about 10 of us all together. And my father was very creative, and in his own way, he wanted to provide for us. And so he made sure that we all had some sort of transportation. It wasn't a new car, but it was a car that worked. And so we would have 5 or 6 cars sitting out in our driveway. And one evening, our car got egged. Our house got egged, and it happened more than once. And it was just, and I was like probably in high school at that time. And it was just really interesting to see the outrage that my father had. It's like this whole notion of, they are against us and I am going to fight back. I don't feel like I am being protected. At that time, you didn't know. It's like, should we have called the cops and report it? And you didn't know at that time. And so you just had to figure out how to deal with it. And so he dealt with it the best way that he thought he knew how, which was he was going to do a stakeout. And I was like, oh no. We were all like, okay, no, Dad, you cannot do that. You cannot take the law into your own hands. There were many occasions where, many of us, the children, had to talk my father down from his reaction and how he wanted to deal with things. And it was like, no, you can't do that. You're breaking the law, right? And so I can't imagine, and that's just my own family's experience. And even for myself to experience, to have a negative experience where I was followed in the mall when I was in high school, and then told to call names and told to go back to my country. And in one of those occasions, I had an elderly aunt with me, and we were shopping. And it was such a traumatic experience for her. And so after we came back from the mall, I had to sit down and talk with her and just say, you know what? Just think about all the good experiences you've had, all the good people. There are good people and there are bad people. So don't let this negative experience stand out for you. Just remember all the good things that's happened here, all the good people, all the good American people that you've met, all the good things that's happened. And so try to move on from that. And so it was just such a traumatic experience to tell, to talk to an elder and talk them through this whole process of that. This is going to happen again. So you just have to be prepared for it.
I'm sorry that happened. I mean, I'm not surprised that it happened, but I'm sorry it happened. Thank you for sharing. There's a lot in what you just shared in that few minutes that we could spend a lot of time unpacking, honestly. I mean, I even think about the difference in legal code between Laos and the United States, and rural Laos and the upper Midwest and the United States more particularly. You know, so and I think, like, I can understand why your dad wouldn't trust the police. You know, I mean, how do you know who you can trust when you feel like nobody's got your back? I don't know, Dang, Shing, what would you guys add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to go, but I think I'm not a historian. I'm not Dr. Salika. I don't know all the historical facts about, you know, sadly, about my culture and my, you know, history. But I only know it through the stories that my grandparents and my dad and mom has told me. And I did a quick refresher yesterday with my dad because we do talk on the phone often. We ended up talking for over 2 hours yesterday. And he told me a little bit about, you know, if I can touch a little bit about some of the historical events that you guys brought up. And my grandfather, so my dad's dad, was a child soldier. He was 13 when he was recruited. As long as you could carry a rifle, you were recruited. And he fought for the French. And, you know, naturally he ended up fighting on the side of the U.S. for the CIA, for the secret war. And during that time, I mean, a lot of what my dad could recall was, you know, crossing the Mekong River, like going through the jungles of Laos, like, you know, at 14, 15, you know, I can't even imagine what it felt like to feel like any decision that you make, any noise that you can make is life or death. And it could cost you not just your life, but your family's life. And so he talked a little bit about that and, you know, bribing people to take you closer to, you know, to Thailand where, you know, you felt that you would have refuge there, and crossing the Mekong River and then getting there and feeling like, you know, you would be saved on a refugee camp, but they don't have room for you. It's overpopulated, you know, and he talked a lot about having to live off the land and building shelter out of nothing, anything they could find. And my family is Catholic, and so there was a lot of Catholic missionaries that were there that were available to help with, you know, as long as you went to church was one of the conditions, that you could have some money and you could maybe get some food. But if you practice shamanism, which a lot of our people do, you wouldn't have access to that. And so my parents, or I should say my dad and my family did have access to that. And so waiting in line, essentially speaking, to get into a refugee camp, and then to find out once you get onto the refugee camp that it's overpopulated, you're sharing 4 bathrooms amongst 12,000 refugees that are also waiting in line. And he had estimated maybe half a mile of a line, maybe 4 to 6 hours waiting in line. And the living conditions were not, they were obviously impoverished. They were not ideal living conditions. And still just hoping in one day that I'll go to America and this will not be my life. And then my dad, of course, met my mom, had 3 of my older siblings. I was born here in Wisconsin, in America, but my older siblings were born on the refugee camp. And so just understanding that context and just knowing where, like my parents are still alive and they're watching, that I can ask them questions about my history and get an immediate feedback or an answer. And I'm fortunate and humble in knowing that I can do that. But, you know, for my grandparents who have passed away, I don't know what their experience was like, you know, being a child soldier, let's say, in war. And so coming to the Midwest, or coming here into America, you know, you had to go through churches, or you had to be sponsored by family, you know, who was already here. And my parents got here in 1987. I was born in 1988. And, you know, kind of dovetailing off of what you said, the language is a barrier. I mean, seeing their first winter, we have it on VHS tape, was an experience. Like, they don't have that kind of winter or that kind of weather. And my mom trying to get her driver's license in the midst of winter. I mean, she broke her legs having an accident. You know, just all of these events that you would not otherwise think of just living here in America, being used to going to the grocery store and like purchasing something off the shelf. That was something completely foreign to my parents who are farmers. You know, that's not something they can relate to. And so, and then not having access to transportation or childcare, and it goes on. And my dad talked a lot about, like, I'm going to better my life for my children, and I'm going to try to go to school and maybe, ESL classes and get some sort of tech degree, and it just didn't work out. He had to get a job. Like, it was like, if you're relying on public assistance, the pressure is and the stigma is get a job. And so that's why I'm in the line of work that I do, because I don't believe that. And I think it is a process, and it's not that you can get a job overnight. There's a lot of like foundational things you need. And so my dad, who had to end up getting a job, went through all these trials and tribulations. I could probably go on, but he had talked a lot about the racism, the overt racism that he experienced. And getting a job and being fired right before your probationary period, so you're not a permanent worker, he knew that's what he was signing up for, but he had to feed his family. He had to provide. And after years of manufacturing and hard skilled labor, he's like, you know what? The only thing I know is farming. I'm going to go back to farming. What are the opportunities here in the Midwest or in Wisconsin, Wausau, Wisconsin, for farming? And it was ginseng. So he went into farming, and to some extent was exploited, got, paid under the table for $4 or $5 an hour, and he took it because that's what he knew, worked 12-hour shifts, if not more, and we would all go with, because they didn't have childcare. So we would all go work in the fields, and I would get 20 bucks a day, and that was amazing for me, but that's what our reality was. And so there was overt racism. There was a lot of stuff that we had to overcome, but my dad always said, like, work ethic is something I learned from my dad. He's always said, like, no excuses. You don't want to rely on other people, whether that's a public assistance program or not. You want to be able to save every penny, and that's what they did. They saved every penny, every dollar to better our lives, and that's where we are. And so that's kind of the history and the experiences that my father has told me, because growing up here, I didn't understand. I couldn't fathom that.
Yeah.
Not only was I a child here in America, grown here, having this privilege, but like really understanding, like, this is really what they went through, and they were quiet about it. Like they were resilient, but they suffered kind of quietly to provide. It was very much survival mode. And that's why I'm thankful, as this generation, I don't have to necessarily be in survival mode. I have opportunities. So
It feels one of the things I've been thinking about today, and as both of you just shared, one of the things I think about is with that first generation of people who came over, the heroism, like heroes that they were, and the choices they made, the sacrifices they made, the things they did to get their families. The only word I can think of is hero. I want to back 1 second up that you were talking about. I believe you said your grandfather, child soldier, 14, 15 years old, trying to go through the jungles and cross the Mekong. When I was 14, 15 years old, my biggest concern in life was how to get this girl, Sarah, from my church to like me. And I say that because it's silly, but I say it also because that speaks to such a disparity in experience. I have not been scarred because Sarah never returned my love. I ended up with Charlotte, my wife, and I'm really happy that things turned out that way. But that I'm not scarred from that little bit of experience. The things I had to worry about, and a lot of us that grew up here in America and who have been here generations, their families have been here generations, didn't have to deal with that kind of trauma, that kind of experience. And so I just wanted to kind of draw that out, especially for those who are listening in and watching right now. Think about what your life was like at 14 or 15 years old, and think about you trying to bear the weight of getting your family through the jungle and across a river so you can be safe, with people taking shooting practice at you. So, Dang, what would you add to this?
First of all, thank you very much to both of you for providing your stories. And I connect a lot with what you both share. And CiC, as you were articulating some of the historical context, it actually rings and it's reminiscent of some of the stories that my father would tell me too as well, about the stories that his parents would tell him, that his grandparents would tell him. My father was born and raised in a small village in Laos called Samnoa, which is north central east area of Laos, and he himself was a direct combatant in the Secret War too as well. And so I don't consider myself very removed from that particular experience, because I grew up directly experiencing and understanding the aftermath of it all. So my father was very young. He was the youngest of four brothers and two older sisters. And he, throughout the war, he actually lost two of his older brothers. Only the eldest and himself from the boys survived. The two sisters are still, my two aunts are still, they survived too as well, that conflict. My father, when I think about that particular time, there are always two very specific things that my father always brings up. The first thing is that it was a very traumatic experience. Because he was in Laos and he was directly in combat, and he was very young. This last year, he just finally retired, and so he's still relatively young even now. And this conversation, actually, when I think about it, 2020 is the perfect time to talk about this and have this conversation, because 2020 is the year that we're celebrating the 45th year anniversary of the Hmong diaspora from Southeast Asia to the United States. And before COVID-19 hit, I was on a work group across the state that was in the process of putting together statewide celebrations in different communities. When my father was a combatant in that experience, he was only in it for about 2 years, because it was on the tail end and he was still exceptionally young in his teens, his early teens. But in 1975, in the fall of Saigon, when the United States pulled out, the second thing that my father tells me comes to mind, because when that happened, my father actually was not at home. He was still out in the fields, out in the battle, and hearing that news, he actually went back to the village where my mother was, and there's this long story that he would tell me about how he was courting my mother during that time, and then hearing stories about how someone in the family had gotten married, and my mother being the eldest daughter in the family, he thought that was her, so he had to run back to the village to make sure that, to see for himself what the news was, just to find out it was my aunt, the younger sister, who had actually gotten married. So when he came back to the village, the entire village actually evacuated, and he went with them. They spent the next 3 years, from 1975 to 1978, actually traversing the jungle. And the stories that they would tell me is that they would stay, they would create makeshift shelters, that were no taller than about 3 feet off the ground. Part of it was because of the materials that were available, but the other part of it was also the fact that, they didn't want to be spotted from far away. And so for about 3 years, 2.5 years, 3 years, they were moving from one location to another, living in one specific place for as short as a week to as long as a couple months, and constantly moving from place to place, and every once in a while hearing gunfire in the distance and then moving again. And throughout that time, my parents, they got married in the jungle, and in 1978, they came to Ban Vinai, one of the largest refugee camps, and what they ended up doing was, my father was very fortunate. He was able to, bribe a fisherman to cross the Mekong River, so he didn't have to swim across. And there were a number of stories. My in-laws and other uncles and aunts and extended family members who I know attempted to cross. Some of them successfully, some of them not successfully. But because he was a direct combatant, it was my understanding that it took a very long time for someone to go into the refugee camps and then come to the United States. It took him a matter of a year, actually, about 11 months. 1979, he came to Washington State. And I think that one thing that my father used to tell me is that the moment they settled in, and from a historical context, the United States tried to practice this policy of where they want to spread out refugees across the United States. Mm-hmm. And so my parents' church sponsors were from Seattle, Washington, and that's where they landed. That's where they stayed for a few months. They stayed with their sponsor for quite throughout the entire time. They learned how to drive badly during that time. And my mother would tell me stories about how scared she was watching my father learn how to drive. And that's what I love so much about my parents, because they always infuse humor into the stories, despite the trauma, despite the difficulties, despite the racism, the overt and covert racism. They always looked at those moments that had moments of levity and humor, and they always infused that into the stories that they would tell us too as well. So I always really appreciated that. From there, they actually traveled to Chicago, Illinois, where they stayed for a little bit, for a few months, where my eldest sister was born, and they settled in Wausau, Wisconsin. And so oftentimes when we think about the Hmong diaspora, we really think about it in two significant waves. The first one in the mid to late 70s was during the first and the early part of the second wave of the refugee experience, the diaspora.
Yeah.
The United States tried to spread out Hmong communities across the United States. And because of that, it was really difficult to have that level of community. And being coming from a society that is very interconnected through the clan system, it was important for them to coalesce around clan leaders or extended family members. And so, I remember growing up in the 90s and hearing the narrative about the reason why a lot of Hmong families moved to Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California was primarily because of the generous social support networks. But that really wasn't it. My parents told me that the primary and only reason they considered moving to Wisconsin was because of family. And that happens to be more of a reality in regards to like the rationale behind why they moved. A lot of the prominent elders actually ended up in the states California and Wisconsin and Minnesota, at least in my particular family, my extended family. And so we ended up in Wisconsin. The second kind of internal migration was moving from where you landed to where your family was. And so that process was an attempt to try to find the appropriate support network. And the only support network that was of the highest priority was that of the family. And so that particular experience was very meaningful for me. And understanding that, and I was born in Wausau, and I was born in central Wisconsin, and I was raised in that community. And I think that the experience for my parents was really difficult because they occupied this really odd and interesting duality. Because while they were adults, they didn't have the language acquisition skills. And so they strongly encouraged me, my siblings, to focus our practice on English language. And we ended up being their translators. And that had a lot of influence in regards to, my own perception of my family and my parents, because I occupied that odd positionality where I held a lot of privilege to some extent, because I had language. I was the one who held onto that particular power in the family. Being the eldest son, I have two older sisters, and I'm the eldest son, and I have four younger brothers. They leaned on me and my two older sisters a lot. I remember in the 90s, my mother got her citizenship, and I remember tutoring and working with my mom, preparing for the citizenship test. I remember reading permission slips to my parents. I remember reading and helping them with their taxes. And granted, I think I was 10 years old at that time. And I remember very much that in the household, education and resiliency were two very important things that they talked about all the time. The need to be resilient, the need to understand that, yes, there are difficult situations that you're going to face and you're going to experience, but, what are you going to do about it? And that was oftentimes their what they would say to me when I would come home, saying that, this happened or that happened at school. And like, well, what are you going to do about it? And so it really cultivated that resiliency. And the education component, it was always drilled into us that the education was one of the few avenues for economic mobility, for social mobility, and that was an important part of the narrative. That was an important part of the story, not only because it gave the family community standing, social standing, political standing to some extent, but it provided opportunities for us and for my parents. I think one of the proudest moments I had was when my mother got her GED. And of course, I was one of her tutors, so I was very proud. It was amazing because, hearing them say that education was important and then seeing them go through that process. I remember the packets coming in the mail, and then her opening it up and kind of like walking through it, reading through it, and then asking me questions. And I would be tutoring her in math, science, reading, writing, all those different things, all while working a full-time job. And so those were things that I remember the most about what those experiences were.
One thing that you said that stuck out to me, and we don't have time to unpack this tonight, but I want to just mention it. Is the impact of trauma.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about even trauma like a child is not built developmentally to teach their parents. It's supposed to happen the other way around. Mm-hmm. And so even that dynamic, while not nearly as traumatic maybe as carrying a rifle through the jungle to try to get your family out of Laos, that's still another layer of trauma that comes from the transition of having to assimilate culturally and linguistically in a new place. And again, I just opened up a whole nother can of worms there. I'm gonna put the top right back on the can, and we're gonna have to seal that up and talk about it another time.
Because there's a whole, I've been here 28 years, and there's a whole issue with Hmong children having to translate with the police.
Yep.
Hmong children having to translate with doctors. And really being asked to be adults far ahead of their time.
Yeah.
And then moving into what was then a hostile, and sometimes is still now, a hostile educational system where they were disrespected in many ways. In the 1980s, we were going through a xenophobic time period. I guess that's the nicest way to put it.
To say the least.
To think about being on the bus. Some of my Hmong friends have told me about being pretty much tortured on the bus going to school. When I first came here, the thing I noticed that Hmong people here were treated as Black people are in the South. And even the stereotypes tended to be the same. And they would be shocked that I would push back on them. So there was this real us versus them that I noticed, because a lot of the white people in Eau Claire still do not understand Hmong history and don't understand that these Vietnam veterans that they worship are alive because of Hmong peoples.
Right. Yeah, that's something a little later on I'm gonna pound on just a little bit. Before we go any further though, I wanna take a moment and just reintroduce our panelists, since we've been talking for a little while here. We've got Sheng Laura Waldinger of the Social Exchange Project. We've got Dr. Salika Ducksworth-Lawton from Uniting Bridges and UW-Eau Claire. Also from UW-Eau Claire, Dr. Ka Vang, and we have Dang Yang, also of UW-Eau Claire. The Blue Goals are well represented in this space. We have a question. I actually want to go ahead, and we've got one question from the community here I'm going to throw out there. And just a reminder, if you've got a question or a comment for our panelists to talk about tonight, please use the chat function in the streaming platform if you're live streaming through Pablo's streaming platform, use that. If you're listening on 99.9 FM and would like to chime in, please email us at the email address Adam shared a little earlier. I'm not going to spell it back out again, but maybe he'd be so kind to put it back. I don't know. It's conversations@tomeswab.com. I'll leave it at that. But we have a question from Kaya Simon, and I'm going to share this with you all and would ask for you to respond. All of your comments have pointed out assumptions or policies that mainstream America got wrong about the earliest Hmong refugees. Now, with 45 years since the first arrivals, what is mainstream America getting wrong about the Hmong community? What incorrect assumptions would you like to correct if you could?
Where to start?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Oh, that's like a whole session.
Well, let's try to keep it on the surface a little bit, because we got some more stuff we want to talk about. But this is a great question. When just to kind of frame it up a little bit more, when Salika was just talking about xenophobia back in the 80s, just back in the 80s,
we're going through a particular wave of anti-Asian xenophobia.
Yes.
Where I was, it was Vietnam refugees who were shrimpers fighting with the Klan. And then when I was in Ohio, It was also the Klan going against Vietnamese who had come over on boats.
Right.
So there was just this convulsion in the 80s that was anti-Asian, particularly anti-Asian and particularly anti-immigrant. That was, it's different than the 1970s where the convulsion was really anti-Arab and somewhat anti-Black. So it was particularly towards Asians in the 80s.
So the rest of you, how would you respond to this?
I think I would say, you know, we spent just 15 minutes just glossing over the history of the Hmong people and where the Hmong came from. And you even still have, even today, you still question, was that even correct, right? So I still get questions about who are the Hmong, why are they here, why don't they go back to their country? And so I think...
That question ticks me off. I just have to tell you that.
It ticks me off too.
I bet.
And it's hard for me to just go off and just say, I'm just as American as you. My skin may be different, but you know, it's like, I don't ask you where you're from and why don't you go back to your country, right? Yeah, so I don't even know where to begin, but I think just the basic of who are Hmong, why are they here, and just a little bit, I'm not asking for a lot, just a little bit of appreciation.
Yeah.
And I'd like to piggyback on what you said about that too as well. Yes, an understanding about the Hmong is really, really important, and it's an important assumption to kind of like address. I think another one is the fact that the idea and the narrative that all Asians are very monolithic to some extent. The Hmong community is, in and of itself, is very diverse in its experiences, educational attainment, and language acquisition and things like that, in profession, background, experiences. But within the Asian community, the Hmong experience is so very unique because we are a refugee population at its heart. And so that in of itself is very, very different already. And so that's certainly one assumption that needs to be acknowledged and addressed.
Right, and then understanding the difference between refugee and immigrant.
Yes, very much.
And oftentimes, that is used interchangeably by people who don't know the difference between the two.
Right. Immigrants tend to choose to come. Right.
I
They're
think
not fleeing something.
white Americans need to understand that Hmong people bought their right to be here in blood. I mean, at a time that white Americans were ducking the draft, y'all saved our lives. And it really pushes us towards the question, what do we owe our allies? What do we owe these people who have taken the brunt of the hell for us so we did not have to? So when I hear someone say, why don't they go back to their own country, I always look at them and say, because they were too busy saving our butt. They can't go back because they saved your grandfather's tail. You know, you owe them. You owe them more than you know. And I guess that assumption that Hmong are not American is one that I know a lot of my Hmong friends, it's aggravating. In many ways, the Hmong experience is more American than some of the people who want to claim patriotism today. I mean, these are people whose families have laid down blood, you know, and now have the right to be buried in veteran cemeteries. We're fighting for several of us are fighting for full veteran honors for the living Hmong veterans.
That's going to be part of our call to action a little later.
Sorry, I did not mean to jump on you.
No, that is really, you're just fine. You're laying the groundwork. Sheng, would you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I can really think of, and maybe this isn't just particularly specifically about Hmong immigrants, but I think just immigrants in general, I think it's the ideology that we may not be able to assimilate correctly, let's say, or don't respect westernized laws or policies. And I go back a lot to a lot of the, and I don't want to get into all of that, but just the differences in like hunting, like,
Right.
not knowing that like you've stumbled upon, hunting grounds that isn't yours, things like that, where it's like we're not intentionally trying to do that. We're not intentionally trying to disrespect you or anything like that. I think that the assumption sometimes is that we are here wanting to maybe live off the system, or we're here in America wanting to take certain jobs or certain things like that. And I just want to say that I think we're just trying as Hmong people to figure out where we belong. I feel like we never really belonged to a certain place. We never really had our own country to call our own. And I feel like we're just simple people trying to just live a happy life with our family and be able to support our family and be self-sufficient the way we define it. And that it's not really us trying to take away something from you. We just want to better understand and maybe share it with you. And I think maybe that's an assumption that people have, again, not particularly against Hmong people, but just immigrants, that like we're here trying to take something. And I just want to say that that is not right. That is incorrect. So
You talking about not having a place to belong. I don't have the authority to make this declaration, but, and I don't want to sound trite, but like you belong here. So I've been in Eau Claire for 15 years, and all I've ever known of the Chippewa Valley has had Hmong influence in it. And I can't imagine what this place would be like without that Hmong influence. And so I know the little bit I know of history. I know like what you're talking about is accurate. I mean, other than when you talk about the roots in China where before the imperial government started messing with them, always on the move, always on the run. But I don't know. In my own little opinion, the Hmong community that's here belongs here. So,
And we're lucky to have.
yes,
We're lucky to have our
100%.
friends here.
So,
We've got a question.
yeah,
up
I know,
there.
and I gotta apologize to Adam again because I jumped all over his role one more time.
Go
Adam, we
ahead.
have another question. Would you please do the honors?
Yeah, sure thing. No problem at all. So this question comes from Jacqueline Lee. Since UWEC is so strongly represented on this panel tonight, what do you think that UW Eau Claire could do better in regards to supporting Hmong faculty and staff, as well as students? And how can UWEC build strong connections with the Eau Claire Hmong population as a whole in the outside community?
Let us hire a Hmong historian.
I second
Let
that.
us hire a Hmong historian and provide more support for a Hmong cultural center and for a Hmong studies program.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been working
Yeah.
with people. I mean, people started working on this in the 80s. When I was the EDI fellow, I started working with people. That's 2011, 2012. It's time. We have, how can we have the largest multicultural group on our campus doesn't have a studies program and doesn't have someone who is solidly here to teach the language, especially with the need for Hmong language in our community? That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It is absolutely, yeah, and I know I'm going to catch a phone call from somebody in the morning. I don't care.
Forward them to me.
No, we're not letting you do it.
I have no authority whatsoever, but forward them to me.
We've been fighting for this, and, we had, I think it was 2014 or 2015, we had a petition with 700 or 800 signatures on it asking for a Hmong historian, asking for these things. They've put in all sorts of things and not done this.
Yeah.
And I will admit, my department is part of the issue. We should just designate a position to it, which is what they want us to do. We're a small department, and we have wanted to give us somebody who is dedicated to this so that we could cover everything. But the other problem here is that, and yeah, I'm going to get a call in the morning, a lack of will. And it needs to come. Y'all don't have to say anything so y'all don't get in trouble. I don't care. I got tenure. I can do this. We need to see the administration show the will to support our Hmong students. When our Hmong students have to come to my 384 Vietnam War class to learn secret war history, that's not fair.
Yeah.
That is just absolutely not fair. When they have to come to me to work on this history, or when they have to go to my colleague Reiko Chanot, who is working with Chinese history, they need somebody who knows this history.
It's legal. I want to add to that too as well,
please,
if I
go
may.
ahead.
This is an opportunity for the university in and of itself to ask itself the hard question about what is the purpose of UW-Eau Claire in the community. And I would argue that one of the main reasons and the rationale behind what UW-Eau Claire's role is in the community is to meet the needs of the community. This has been a conversation for quite some time, and I think this is an opportunity for them to take, because this is something that has been requested from the Hmong community all these years. It's not necessary to ask the question anymore, because these conversations have been had, and it's reframing the purpose of UW-Eau Claire in the community, and this is one way in which they can meet that particular need. This has been a conversation that has been happening, as you said, for decades.
Yeah.
A need that has been addressed because we need individuals. But the elders are asking for an educational component to help educate the Hmong community in the history of the Hmong culture, the traditions, the language, all those different components, because they don't have the same type of time and ability to do that in the same way that they would have traditionally, to immerse the younger generation into like traditional practices, into traditional cultures, traditional language. And so because that doesn't exist organically in the same way that it used to, the next space to do that is in formal education, whether it's like K-12 or in higher education. And admittedly, there are efforts that are being had in the Eau Claire School District. We have to give credit where credit is due, and there are efforts that UW-Eau Claire has done. But I think there's so much more. And God, I hope they call me.
Yeah.
I hope they call me tomorrow. I hope they call me tomorrow, because
No,
I've
they're
been
going to
talking about
call
this for a
me
long
because
time.
I'm supposed
No.
to behave better, and I'm not behaving today.
But here's the thing. So let me let you off the hook for just a second, though. This isn't just about UW-Eau Claire.
No.
This question came in because we have UW-Eau Claire. We have a strong blue gold representation here, but this is about the Eau Claire and Chippewa Valley community overall as well. And how do we help educate non-UW-Eau Claire students, and whether they're Hmong or they're not Hmong, on Hmong history, so we can understand our neighbors, so we can understand ourselves and our neighbors.
Yeah.
Is there an opportunity, and I'm asking you guys in your expertise, is there an opportunity for there to be a partnership between the city of Eau Claire, the county of Eau Claire, and the university to develop things in concert with one another, where you're serving not only the university needs around this stuff, but the community at large?
It's interconnected, and I think that absolutely there is opportunity to do so. I think that in the process of doing so, I really need to emphasize that there has to be an acknowledgement, a formal acknowledgement to some extent, that indigenous ways of knowing is just as important, because the ways in which we credential expertise.
Right.
There is no credentialing Hmong language. We live it. We speak it. It's an oral tradition. We can't credential this. And so it would be near impossible to find someone who has a PhD in Hmong linguistics. I hope it exists somewhere, but I can't imagine that it does anywhere right now.
And that would have just been an effort to take that specifically Hmong dynamic and frame it in a Western educational framework.
Exactly. So indigenous and cultural knowledge in of itself has to be respected throughout the process, and that's the cornerstone of being able to do this well.
You have 3 people here who are on the regional task force for the Toward One Wisconsin conference. And we're hoping that that conference, which is next May, is going to lead us to the kind of community, university, business community combination that will allow us to serve not just our Hmong students, but our general population, in a better way. But it's hard. We're in an era of scarcity, and they're looking for, and I'm seeing the question that's on the board that Adam hasn't had a chance to read yet. So he might as well just read it.
There was a follow-up question to the question about a Hmong program at UWC, asking, is there a shortage of funding at UWC for this position? And I think, Dang, you kind of touched on this as far as credentials and hiring go of a position like this, but is there a lack of funding for it, or?
There's a shortage of funding for positions, period.
For everything.
For everything.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm just going to be really honest and lay it on the ground there. COVID has messed up funding for every university in the United States.
Yeah.
And because of that, because the cost, we don't even know the cost yet of having converted these classes to online, of having to do what we need to do to protect our students, because we will protect our students. The university is reluctant to invest in small programs and reluctant to invest in positions where they don't already have a lot of evidence of exponential growth. Okay, I'm not supposed to say that, but I'm saying it.
You said it.
You said it.
I've said it. So really what needs to happen is the community and the schools and the students need to make it clear to the administration that this is what they want and help us fundraise for it. So that's what's going to happen.
So question for you, Salika, is how much more clearer do the Hmong students and Hmong community need to make their case to administration? I mean, I'm thinking about what's been done in the past, right? There's petitions, there's demands already written up.
Well,
in black and white.
You need can I just throw this out there? You need advocates from outside that community that will push and shove and nudge and be a pain in the rear until things happen. And I'm thinking about, like, for example, if there's not funding for this position, but we think this needs to happen, like we think this has got to happen, then who do we find outside of the university system that can fund something and help us out? That money's only going to be allocated to this. And so we might need to find creative solutions. But there comes a point where it's like, and Salika can speak to this when it comes to racism with black folks. Black folks have been hollering for years, and until white folks started paying attention and saying something, white folks didn't want to listen.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, we need skilled labor here. And this is where I would challenge some groups like the Chamber, et cetera, to work with UWEC to fundraise this. It takes between 1.5 million and 2 million. I'm not going to swear by that number. I think I'm going high. It may be a little lower, to endow a chair for a department. We got a Hmong Studies position a couple of years ago, in part because we were having some problems and we needed it. And I think we need it again. I think that we can make the case. This is where I'm going to put my Zhang on the spot and say that she and John Lohr could go corral some people and do this, because I'm a faculty member. So there's limitations on what they're going to allow me to do. But the people out in the community...
That's what I'm saying. That's where the pressure's got to come.
Y'all can put the pressure on in ways, and also say, and we won't bust your budget by doing the fundraising for you.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now I might get yelled at tomorrow by saying, well, maybe we wanted to fundraise for something else. Yeah. And I'm like, I can retire in 2 years. They can yell at me. Let me put this privilege on the ground.
That'll give you more time to cause trouble.
Yes, that would be an argument for them not to let me retire.
Hey, Adam, I think we have another question.
Yeah, we've got another question from Marion here. Marion asked, how can area arts organizations collaborate with or support Hmong artists? Mm-hmm. Are there possibilities for collaboration in things like fiber arts, theater, music, and both traditional and contemporary Hmong art?
There's
looking
a
at
lot
Dang.
there are a lot of Hmong artists in the local area.
Absolutely.
And I think that that is one of the areas that we are, an opportunity that we're absolutely missing out on. Cultivating that artistic community here in the Chippewa Valleys, particularly the Hmong community and those artists here. I think part of it is the narrative about what possibilities may exist for Hmong artists and the ability to see themselves as an artist, an individual who can actually make a living doing this, things that they love, whether it be in theater arts, visual arts, or music, whether it's traditional music or contemporary music. I think that there is definitely, the population is there. I think to some extent helping to cultivate that, providing opportunities for those young artists to rise up through the ranks. I think that I remember growing up in the 1990s, and that's when the Center for Hmong Art and Talent in the Twin Cities, St. Paul, opened up. And that cultivated a significant pseudo-renaissance, to some extent, an artistic renaissance among the Hmong community. And I think that that, to some extent, is already happening in Wisconsin. A lot of those successful artists in those different areas and disciplines are mentoring and supporting their own the younger artists as well, as in the music industry, in the art industry, the visual arts, theater. But there's still a lot of absolute growth in that particular area, the untapped talent that hasn't yet been cultivated yet.
I've thought about that with music a lot, actually, because I work with Converge on a volunteer basis, and we play a couple of tracks by Panya Zhang, who is well known amongst the Hmong community in the United States and in Europe, and incredibly talented. But I know like there are other voices and musicians amongst the Hmong community that like we need to hear, and so I'd be interested in. We've got, you can't see her, but the station manager for Converge is sitting off on the offset here, Ashley. But one of the things I would love to do is figure out how do we help enhance opportunities for Hmong musicians. Like how can Converge help in that process, and how can Pablo help in that process, and what can we do to not only give them exposure, but help them, give them space to develop in a public setting where they can, learn their chops and that kind of thing. So whether you're talking about more traditional Hmong music or you're talking about new stuff that people are developing, like Panya, for example, does not do traditional Hmong music. She sings in Hmong, but her music sounds very Western.
It's very contemporary.
Yeah, it's very contemporary. So that's one of the things I would love to explore. How do we do that? And then even beyond that, this is where my blood starts pumping, is how do we do collaboration where that cultural Hmong musical influence gets blended with other musical influences, and you come up with something new.
Yeah.
That's exciting to me.
You know what an important strategy would be? It'd be bring in, because Panya Zhang is an Eau Claire native.
I know.
And so it's really important because a lot of the relationships have to be built and that level of trust between the wider artistic community and the Hmong artist community. And so I think one particular strategy is bringing those established Hmong artists to come in and start having those conversations and start leading those workshops and start doing those particular things. And that would draw those artists in, those young artists in, and building those mentoring relationships and getting them connected to established organizations, established agencies, established mentors too as well in other capacities.
If y'all know Panya, put a little pressure on her, because I keep talking to her about trying to do something here. I interviewed her a couple of years ago. Plug for my website. If you go, there's an in-depth interview with Panya on the tomeswab.com. But yeah, she's a delightful person, and I'm sure that she would love to invest. If we found the right way for her to invest in other Hmong musicians here, I think she'd love that.
Yeah, and she's not too far from here. She's in the cities now.
Yeah, so we can go get her.
I see Pablo stream here.
Yeah.
Yes.
The idea having of the Pablo Center hosting a Panya Zhang concert, I think is amazing. I think it would draw
I think
quite an audience.
I think so too. Well, we got to, Ashley, Pablo people, We got this in mind now, all right? We got to
Can I
work on
just
this.
quickly say something about creatives, though?
Yes, please.
So I consider myself a newbie podcaster, okay? I started this because I thought it was fun. I wanted to do something great, and I just want to give a plug to Collab and Adam here, and just helping me, really connecting me. And I think, you know, a lot of people in our community, perhaps they don't feel that level of trust yet to kind of reach beyond their comfort level to see what does our community offer. And I have to say, I love Eau Claire so much because it does offer so many people opportunities to create and to provide, you know, like a platform for their music, let's say. And I'm just going to give other plugs, like the Plus, when they were open, I was there all the time. They had open mic, and anyone could
open mic.
Yes, and they could perform and they could showcase their skills and their talents, and I think it's a little pull from both sides. I think, like, you know, for me, I had to go out tenaciously looking for opportunities, and I understand maybe not everybody is comfortable to go outside their comfort zone and look for that. But I myself just loved to create, and so I don't consider myself an artist at all. I mean, I would do a disservice if I said, you know, in any other category like singing and acting, I can't do anything like that. But I know people who can. I feel like it's hidden talents.
You're
and
so
I love Eau Claire, and I think Eau Claire has so much to give, and I think it's just really bridging that gap somehow. And maybe it's a little pressure on both sides and responsibilities on both ends to kind of make that connection. But maybe the community needs to provide more opportunities.
And trust needs to be built, right?
Yes, I do think that there needs to be some trust that's built. I'm on a subcommittee, and I guess I won't say where, but we're trying to establish and figure out how do we bridge those gaps so that we can build that trust. And it really just comes down to education and truly, you know, not wanting to know something or know about people because you want something from them, but really because you want to offer something. Like that place, that intent of like being genuine about your intent. And so anyway, going back to podcasting, like I really had to find opportunities to make what I wanted to have happen. And I think Eau Claire does offer that. I think it's just really bridging that gap, so.
Yeah. So first of all, I got to say something about you.
Oh, gosh.
Except that you are incredible and exceptional, and you are far too modest.
Yes.
Oh, stop.
So,
keep going.
so just we need to call that out, because Sheng is a great example of a young Hmong American woman who has dove into this podcasting thing and excels at it. From what I have observed, excels at it.
A lot of trial and error, I have to say.
That's okay.
Hard.
Hey, that's all of us, right?
It's part of the art.
Still creative.
But yeah, so don't believe what she says about her not being creative and artist and all that kind of stuff. It's not true. That's it.
Spoken word, you are an artist.
That's right.
Thank you.
Man, I could talk about the art stuff all night, y'all. I'm just telling you. Good. But we're kind of starting to draw to the end here. Now, I want to talk about, before we close the show, believe it or not, it's almost 9 o'clock. This is what it feels like this every time, y'all.
Yeah.
We get to close to 9 o'clock, and it's like, are you kidding me? And we feel like we scratched the surface on so many things. So we're talking about, Adam, if you could go back to that other question, how do the struggles impact Hmong life? So we've talked about the various struggles that the Hmong community has experienced: overt racism, learning how to do life in America, which is dramatically different, and specifically the Upper Midwest, dealing with winters, all these things. How do these things impact Hmong life now, would you say? And what kind of new struggles are in play? And we've got to probably keep it to 1 or 2 sentences because we're drawing close to the end here. Sheng, you want to kick us off? What do you think?
You know, if I'm going to keep it short, I think economically, in terms of maybe not just non-English speakers, but finding opportunities for employment that's going to be meaningful to them, that's not just like manufacturing and things like that. but economically and then also professionally. So like being able to network with other professionals in a place where you feel safe and you feel comfortable. And again, I will tenaciously try and find those opportunities, but it's not always something that seems welcoming or inviting, I would say. So maybe, I don't know strategies or ideas, but maybe something like that to that extent.
Well, we don't expect you to get it all solved tonight, but that's
I'll write
good.
an essay and hand it in tomorrow.
There you go.
I'm going to pass it to Dr. Vang.
Well, I was thinking about new struggles, and I don't know if it's a new struggle. It's the struggles are all the same.
It's just the same
which
stuff.
is really interesting because the very same thing that I struggle with growing up, I am seeing the younger generation struggle with it as well. Like this whole concept of Hmong female going away to college. It's a constant struggle, right? No matter how advanced we think we are, we're still there, right? Another struggle is, of course, I guess you could call it the poor working middle class. I think, many Hmong people who came over earlier are now at that stage where they have a degree, but not necessarily in a high-paying field. So both mom and dad have a degree, both mom and dad work, and so they have this income that disqualifies them for scholarships or grants, but yet they are not making enough to send their children to college, which I think is, like I mentioned, it's not necessarily a new struggle, but it's a struggle in itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. It's like a trap and a cycle you can't get out of.
I think really quickly to answer this particular question about how do these struggles impact Hmong life in the Valley now, I think it's important to contextualize the fact that the three of us, the three Hmong individuals representing this particular conversation, we wield a very privileged positionality. We're highly educated individuals. The 2018 U.S. Census estimates shows that 80% of Hmong households in the U.S. is a place where English is not the primary language. High school attainment is across the U.S. for Hmong community members is at about 25-30%, or 25 or 30%. I'm sorry, of Hmong youth are individuals who have education less than high school diploma, bachelor attainment, master's degree attainment, postgraduate attainment. It dwindles down from there as well. And so I think that the way in which this impacts us now is the need to elevate those voices that you allude to as well. It's a need to acknowledge the fact that there's still a lot of internal discussions that our community is struggling with, that we're still coming to terms with. We're still working out the duality of trying to honor the traditional cultures and at the same time looking at ways in which we can decolonize our own experiences and better understand anti-oppressive practices in our culture. I think that those are the things, that's one of the biggest impacts and conversations that we're having in our community right now, and that bleeds into how we integrate and how we work within the community, how we interact with the community as we're struggling with these conversations in our own community.
So, thank you. We, again, scratching the surface, and there's a lot more discussion that needs to happen. I got to start wrapping this up because we're getting there. We're getting there quick. So I just want to say, as I kind of reviewed Hmong history, the little bit that I did today, and there's so much more to know, and certainly the 7 minutes that I spent talking about it earlier during our conversation doesn't do it justice. There's a lot more to it than that. But I will say, as I reviewed what I did review this afternoon, I just honestly was grieved at what this people group has endured. It's a group that's been persecuted historically, marginalized. And despite the fact that President Kennedy said that our involvement in Laos would have nothing to do with the Cold War, the truth of the matter is the U.S. government used the Hmong people in Laos as political pawns. And they have been, in many senses, dehumanized in Laos and other places, slaughtered and violated in multiple ways, children sent to war. We talked about the horror stories with that. And then in the middle of all that, the U.S. Leaves Laos and abandons them, despite assurances that we would take care of them. And then they come here, and we heard stories even tonight about stories of racism and at best a lack of empathy. And I would say even along with the lack of empathy, a lack of understanding about their story. And I came here 15 years ago, like I said earlier. I've only been in Eau Claire for 15 years, and all I've ever known of Eau Claire has been seasoned with the Hmong community. And I can't imagine it any other way. And as I looked at the history of these people, their families, the people that I see every day in Eau Claire and in the Chippewa Valley, and I consider their history, I can only reckon them and their fathers and their grandfathers, their mothers and their grandmothers as heroes. And it's a shame that we don't see them in this way. So my call to action for us, Salika alluded to this a little bit, but we got to do better for these veterans and their families. Because they weren't part of the U.S. military, they weren't technically considered U.S. veterans, but they fought and bled for us, for our government. Over in Minneapolis, St. Paul, there's a new commemoration for these strategic guerrilla units that served our purposes and saved American lives over in Southeast Asia. We can do more. We can lean in and get to know our neighbors. Instead of classifying them as a group of people, why don't we actually spend time with our neighbors that look, maybe speak differently than us, and get to know their stories? And maybe when we do that, we'll find out that they're heroes. Maybe when we do that, we'll find out that they're much more than what we thought. Well, thank you so much for tuning in this week. Thank you to the Pablo Center for being such great hosts and the Pablo Group for being a part of this Uniting Bridges Converge Radio. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. I really appreciate you and appreciate what you added to this discussion and the ways hopefully you've opened some minds and some more discussions down the line here. Please come back and join us next week as we have our next episode of Conversations in Color. Thank you so much, and I wish you peace this week.
전화, 우리 시절 좋대.
어쩌.